Hello, everyone, and welcome to 32Soft's August webinar. I'm Denise, your host, and with me to present is a QAD and MRP expert, Don Lindsey. As always, we do have much to cover, so we will jump right into housekeeping. Please know that everyone connects to the webinar already muted, but you can type in your questions or if you have comments at any time throughout the session. Type them into the bottom of your control panel where you will hopefully see the big red arrow pointing. And then during the Q&A, I will read the questions in the order they're received. Also, a very brief survey will pop up at the end of the session today. We ask only 2 questions, and there is also a field to add any additional comments. We are grateful always for any and all responses. And truly, it takes less than a minute to respond. And as soon as the replay of today's session is available, I will follow up with our Encore email. It will include a link directly to the replay, all of today's questions and answers. Finally, I will hand off to Don Lindsey, who is a business analyst for several companies and has 18 years of QAD ERP experience. And throughout those years, Don has worked with 7 different versions of QAD. We are delighted to have Don with us to share his wealth of knowledge. So Don, whenever you are ready, I will hand off.
I think I'm ready. Let's see what Bill Gates gives us here. Give me the...
Gotcha.
Okay, well, good morning, and thank you, Denise, for that glowing introduction. Well, last month we covered some aspects of QAD having to do with Sarbanes-Oxley, or what we call SOX, user definitions, some tools for security access, how to define roles, permissions, and memberships. We took a quick look at the menu structure in QAD, and today we'd like to continue on this road and talk about some more of the advanced aspects of security having to do with configurable screens and audit trails. Just a word of disclaimer. The implementation of configure screens and audit trails requires a fairly in-depth knowledge of not only QAD functionality, transactions, work orders, etc. Also a fair amount of experience that progress QAD admin functionality, operating systems, .NET, etc., etc. So, as we begin, let's review a little bit of what we did last week, then we'll talk about some additional SOX considerations, and then I'll get into configured screens and audit trails. Just a quick note, next month Alex is going to talk about autoload. Then I'm going to be speaking at the Midwest Users Group in Columbus on the 22nd on the subject of MRP versus DDRP. If anybody is planning on attending the MUG meeting, please stop by the 32Soft booth or look me up. I'd love to speak to people in person. In October, well, I am on a cruise through New Zealand, Australia, and Hawaii for my 50th wedding anniversary. Olena's going to be covering customer schedules. I'll be back in November and January for a couple of sessions on inventory control and management, then a couple of sessions considering purchasing. So, as I always say, when we address any new function in QAD, there's lots of new terms, words, etc., etc. So if you don't know what they are, you can look them up on Google. You can go to the knowledge base in QAD or send Denise and I or a email, and we will be glad to assist. As I always say, it's a real good idea if you have strong work instructions, screen prints, etc., and a wiki. I've pointed out the last couple of sessions that there's a great presentation. I love my QAD wiki from Spring Mug 2008 by Mr. Linder of Right Way Fasteners. Great read. So Terminology is always good. Last month we covered SOX. We discussed the security plan that you need to establish, and then we talked about the 36.3.24 security control and what settings are required there for password maintenance, and then we jumped over and we looked at 36.3.1 user maintenance, actually creating a user in QAD, and then how to reset and establish his password. Then we talked at a little bit of length regarding the role create. Roles replaced groups in the previous versions of QAD. So you create roles, then you assign QAD menus to roles in the 36.3.6.5 roles permission, and then we get those permissions and menus assigned to roles in the role membership maintain. So it's kind of a circular process. Create the users, roles, establish menus, and then link them all together with membership. These are very important in terms of security and what we're going to be speaking of today in terms of both the configured screens and audit trails. So let's talk about internal controls that SOX requires. Internal controls are policies and procedures that are put in place to ensure that the reliability of accounting systems is consistent. Accountants, managers can't make informed decisions unless the financial reports of the organization contain no errors. Internal controls in accounting can basically be broken down into 7 areas or categories, and these include separation of duties, accounting systems, physical audits, standardized financial daily and weekly trial balances, and periodic. So if we look at segregation of duties, this is basically splitting responsibilities for bookkeeping, deposits, reporting, generation of invoices, etc. We're not going to spend a lot of time on segregation of duties today, but later, probably in the spring, I'm going to talk about both segregation of duties and electronic signatures. We talked extensively last week about access and controlling access both to the system by users with passwords, etc. It's always a good idea, and I'm sure that a lot of us still do physical inventories, and it's recommended that the accounting function do physical hand counting of cash, count physical assets. I remember having to use the fixed asset module of QAD to do physical assets of computers, desks, etc. So the internal controls require that the system be validated by actually physically control. I always remember my first accounting boss was a controller, and he drilled into my head that that word is very apropos to the description of what these financial people do. They control. Standardized forms, documents, invoices help maintain consistency across time. There's a need, even with the double entry bookkeeping account system that we talked about a couple months ago. It is always in balance, but it's always a good idea to generate daily or weekly trial balances so that the management and financial members can actually look at and possibly discover or investigate discrepancies as early as possible. There's periodic reconciliations of accounting systems that are required, and then finally approval or authority requirements, so that managers are signing off on requisitions. For example, 32Soft has a PO requisition system. Global Requisitions in QAD has a approval matrix that is possible. Product Change Control has an approval matrix. So making sure that managers are reviewing the process is part of this internal control method. It's real simple. If you're involved in the SOX process, you probably want to keep track of this. We've developed a simple spreadsheet. It talks about the categories. There's a control number associated with that, the description of what the control is, how often it's run, annual, as needed, continuous, daily, and then a place for internal. So if you just create a simple spreadsheet like that, it helps you keep track of these internal controls. Segregation of duties, as I mentioned, we're not going to talk a lot about segregation of duties, but it's basically a process to ensure or prevent fraud and error in the system. You should always have the development, the test, production environments segregated so that testing and validation is independent of programmers' change. Database system networks are independent of developers. And there's just a whole lot of information about the segregation of duties and who has when, administrative passwords, QAD admin rights, trade ID, ADP if you've got it. So there should be elevated access and secures for these kinds of logins. Configured screens are one of QAD's most powerful tools in terms of security. It gives the system the ability to manipulate the menus and the frames that users see in QAD. I always liken configuring screens to painting. It's one of the real artsy parts of QAD. You can do some really cool things with configured screens. It's a design tool. It only takes a one-time setup. We'll run through that. There are some limitations, there's advantages, and then we'll talk about how to configure screens. The configurable screens, as they are called in EE, were called simplified screens in some of the earlier versions of .NET, but the concepts are basically the same. So the function of configure screens allows you to disable fields for input, hide fields, set predefined defaults, set mandatory fields, add fields and frames, and basically control the navigation of frames in QAD. The benefits are that it can simplify and speed up data entry. For example, 711, if anybody's been into sales order maintenance, you know it's a lot of clicking, a lot of frames, and the configure screens gives you the capability of configuring a streamlined version of that 711 frame for people who are just doing order entry, maybe not the accounting manager, the customer service manager, but just the customer service reps could have a screen designed just for themselves. Hiding and disabling fields helps you enforce this SOX separation of duty and other requirements. Configure screens are stored in XML files, therefore they can be backed up and transferred to other environments. That is, you can design them in test and then promote to production. Once a screen has been configured, it's also possible to log or lock out the telnet mode, the old Chewy version, so that users must use the new template in the .NET environment. Some considerations: the template controls the behavior of the program. We'll see how that works. When we're creating a new record to navigate through a screen, the database is not updated, but the recording of a sequential numbers, such as sales order numbers or work order numbers that are set in control files, may be incremented, so you need to have caution about that. When an existing record, you may hide mandatory fields which will not produce an error in the template, but it could when you run it in production. So changes and updates made to data during the design and preview mode are not saved to the database. That helps you with actually creating and modifying them. Some performance considerations: consider the impact of deleting a field at a later stage. So if you add a field or defaults to a field, are you really going to need those? And what's the ramification of deleting in the future? If the field is in constant use, it can create many records in the database. When you delete a field, all of its values are deleted. So you want to make sure that you remove a field. You don't delete a field in a frame without deletion. So limitations: you cannot change the screen logic, i.e. which fields are in which frames. You can't change a field format, so if it's a decimal point or a character, you can't change that. You can't require validations. There are data entry on a field is not required to update existing data, only required when somebody edits the field. This is another caution for the users. I've seen users get very confused on that particular point. Scrolling up and down through records may update files that were added to screen, another caution. You can't run different templates on different menus. Need to be aware of that, and it only works in .NET. Rule of thumb: testing and validation of a new configured screen must be done in a test environment before promoting to a production environment. I've seen catastrophes happen by not thinking out the logic and the structure of a new configured screen in a production environment. It can cause data issues. Obviously, users can be concerned, and you just need to really test and validate what you're going to do with configured screens. So the configured screen is really easy to set up. You just type in configure to your application, brings you to this configured screen menu. You choose configured screen setup. You set the enable button to check. You define a group or role that is going to be able to create and edit these configured screens, and then you just hit the save button, and now you're ready to create a template. So to create a template, you select the program. So here I've selected 711. I right click and just go down to the design. It then allows you to enter a name. Okay, I say pick the template name carefully. Use the menu option. If you're going to use other names, just be very aware of how your organization wants to treat the template identification. Then there's the description. Again, caution. I've seen bad things happen when you don't pay attention to the description of the particular template. Then you can either check for all users, or if you decide you can assign a particular template to a group of roles or a particular role. So that harks back to our discussions last week of how you define the roles permissions and memberships in your organization. So you need to really have a good handle on roles in QAD before you attempt to do this configured screen. So how do you configure? You just hit the little green button. You can, once you've created a configured screen, you can go through a preview, which allows you to walk through the template without modification, or you just hit the green, which allows you to create or modify a template. So we're going to go ahead and configure the sales order screen. Here you've got a new little box that comes up. It's kind of complicated, but as you work through it, it becomes more and more familiar. There are the available fields that are in the frame. Remember, that was one of the things you can't change, is the available fields. Then you've got the selected fields, which are the fields that are actually going to be shown on the frame or the menu. Then you've got this little auto navigate. We'll talk about this a little bit more, but it allows you to go next or back, or in this case, none, just use the frame as it is. And this is very, very handy. I'm sure that a lot of us are sometimes frustrated by the back button in QAD. And so you can do some nice things that modify or mollify the user's dislike of that back button through that auto navigate function. You can change the tab order, which we'll talk about a little bit later. You can back and it will save it, or you can just hit the save button. So you need to become a little bit familiar with these areas of the configured screen. You see here you've got, just like you do in some of the other Microsoft applications, you can add records to the selected fields, and you can delete records from the selected fields. So available fields, there's the standard fields, which you would normally expect to see in a frame, SO item, SO number, SO status, etc., etc. And you've also got these user fields that are available for you to add to frames. And as you click this little add button, it will add those to the fields. So these available fields are added to the frame. Then there is this little default area over here on the right of the screen. You can set defaults, you can disable, you require, and you apply those. We'll talk a little bit more about those in just a moment. There's the user fields, and this gives you the properties of those user fields. You can see here that most fields in QAD have user definable character, decimal, and numeric values that you can use either through Progress or through these configured screens. So you can edit those fields because users are not going to understand what SO_CHRO3 is. So you should, this is read over, you can see what table it's in, you can see the name that the programmer has assigned to it. It gives you an indication of what data type it is, character, date, logic, decimal, etc., etc. It defines what the format is. This again is read only, so we said you can't modify that. But then you come down here to the label, and here a big word of caution as to how you name that. Be very cognizant of the nomenclature that you're going to use to name a label, because that's going to be now shown in the menu itself, and if it's not clear to everybody in your organization, there might be some confusion. So you need to do a fair amount of research with the users to understand what those labels should be. There are also validations that you can enter. It gives you the capability of using 36.2.13, our favorite general or generalized code maintenance screen, and you can also put in a program that you might want to use. Let's say you wanted to use a VLOOKUP, or you wanted to do a progress program. You can use that in terms of validation. You can add new fields. All you do is select a new field after you've edited it and given it a name. You click the little box there, and it then is added to the screen. Just a word of caution with adding new fields to the screen. There's only so much real estate, and you need to be very cognizant of naming, the position, the sizing, and the movement of new fields on the screen. As I mentioned earlier, it's almost like painting within QAD, so there's a little bit of art to it, there's a little bit of skill to it, so you need to be aware of that. You can change the field label that we talked about. Be careful with that. You can make a field a required field. You just click the button, click the required field and check apply, and that field turns blue. So every time users go through, they have to fill in that field. You can make a field a default value if you want, say, a site to always come in, say 10. You can default that value for that site value. You can change the defaults, as in most places with QAD, and defaults will not be applied when editing existing data. So the defaults will turn to red, so it's very obvious to the user. You can disable fields, so that you just click the box, highlight the field, click the box and apply, and that basically disables the field. The user will still be able to see it, but there might be information in there that's pertinent to their job, but they won't be able to affect it. So it turns gray. You can hide a field, and this is very helpful with specifically designing configured screens for a group of users. Simply choose the field, and you click the little left-facing arrows, and it will then take that field off of the screen. So again, be cautious with how you do that, but that's available. You can change the tab order that I mentioned. Just click on the tab order, and that brings up this little dialog box. You up or down. This is very, very handy. If I know a lot of users are not happy with the sequence of tabs in particular maintenance frames, sales order, work orders, etc. And so you can, through conversation with your users, define the best tab order that you want. Simply set those tabs. You can, as we mentioned, use the auto navigate. If none, it just is a normal screen. You can go auto next or auto back. We at one of my clients don't use shipping data. And so that little frame in 1.4.1 shipping information, we just do an auto next on it. And so the users don't have to even think about it. You can also do some interesting things with back, as I mentioned, in terms of our lovely back button in QAD. So, and there we go. Oops. You can add frames. So this is a very powerful process. You can add frames into menus. All you do is hit the little add frame box. It brings you up a new frame. And again, word of caution, this needs to be well thought out. The frame designer comes up. You would then set a new title of a frame. Again, be cognizant of how you name these things. And then you can manipulate the frame and set the tab orders in those. There is a report called the template conflicts screen, which will give you any conflicts that exist when users belong to more than one group or role. And so you can use this very handy tool to very quickly find out which conflicts exist. Conflicts can exist because an option has 2 or more templates. If a user has 2 or more templates, that can cause some issues. So just be aware of those conflicts as you're running through them. So 36.4.16 is the Configurable Screens report. This is a handy report, gives you all configured screens, details out which fields and frames you might want to be concerned with. I would always print out and save one of the reports for SOX audits, so you've got a record of what you got. So, as a summary, configured screens enable you to help individuals get their job done more quickly and efficiently. By eliminating fields that you're not using at your site, you can reduce training time and very significantly reduce the potential data input errors that you might have. However, you must have a very clear understanding of how a particular function is used before you change input requirements. That's a given. As I said, you really need to test it in one of your sandbox databases before you actually promote it to the production environment. So, because of its inherent flexibility, it's like painting, okay, mentioned with oils. Each company is going to have its own version of the implementation of configured screens. But it is an extremely powerful tool to assist in these SOX requirements. So let's talk a little bit about audit trails. Audit trails, why do we need audit trails? Well, if you're familiar with 21 CFR Part 11, which is the Title 21 of the Code of Federal Regulations, which deals with the food and drug environment for electronic records and electronic signatures, this mandates that the use of a secure computer-generated timestamp audit trail to record updates to electronic records. So in other words, if a user changes a field or something in QAD changes a field, the CFR 211 wants you to keep track of that. So QAD has given us these audit trails. Now, not all areas of your system require compliance, but the audit trails allow you to set these up and enable them on specific tables and fields that you want. CFR 211 also allows for electronic signatures, and again, we won't get into that too much right now, but we will cover that early next year. And basically, audit trails are a major underpinning of any Sarbanes-Oxley or SOX initiative. So QAD gives us 2 elements, the audit fields and the electronic signatures, to address these requirements of 21 CFR 211. There, in EB 2.1, there were audit trails. In SAE, there were audit trails. But now in EE, we're given the opportunity to actually create our own audit trails. The way you do that is enable the database. You enable a separate database so that the system can keep track of this. You grant access to auditing functions. You load auditing policies. You enable tables. If you need to archive, you set up the archive. And we're not going to cover this in detail because this is very, very intense and complicated. I give my kudos to Vinud at SIG. He sent me a whole bunch of Audit Trail documents that will help you, but if you're going to set up Audit Trails, you need help. Even a sophisticated user is going to have difficulty setting up all these various audit databases and the process to do that. But once you've got them set up, QAD recommends that you, before you use Audit Trails, and you as a user can define which tables and which fields are going to be audited, recommends that you look at entity diagrams and database definition reference guides to assist you in this process. Audit table or database definitions, if anybody doesn't have access to this, this is the report that shows all of the myriad of tables in QAD, along with the grouped by module, and you can see the field name, the label, the column label, format, decimal functions for particular fields. It also defines indexes. I'm not going to get into a discussion of indexes, but the system will define what indexes are pertinent to a field: primary, the index name, whether it's unique, field name, ascending, abbreviated descriptions, etc. And then that feeds you into the entity diagram, and the entity diagram basically shows you all of the tables and the relationships to other tables along with those index fields. So this is very, very helpful in terms of users being able to find which tables and which fields are going to be audited in the system. In 3612.13.5, all you do is set up a particular, you select a database, you select a table, customer master, for example, and then you set the action as enable that field. From there, you can then go into the field itself and just hit the space bar, and that will tell you which tables are actually going to be available for auditing. Then you can select a particular field. In this case, I'm selecting CM Master, and then the particular fields that you want, you simply hit a space bar in that little goodie, and then it will show you which ones are enabled. And another caution, you need to understand, if some point in the future you're going to change, will this particular field be reviewed? I've had circumstances where they've checked each field in a particular table, and it just uses up space in the database. And these audit databases can get extremely large in terms of size. So be cautious of which fields you are going to select for audit, and then you can get a nice little report out. And again, I would print this out for your annual SOX audit in 3612.13.6. This gives you the table, any identifying fields, and then the fields that are audited. And we are constantly adding fields and taking fields out of these in some points. So what QAD does then is it keeps track through progress in these databases and triggers and all that technical stuff. And then you can use 3612.2, the Audit Trail report, to get data out of the system. So you simply go in and select the database that you want, the table name that you're going to look at. You can do it by user ID if you suspect a particular user is changing fields he shouldn't have. You can do it by program name, and then most importantly, the two the from and to dates in the system. So you can run this on a monthly period or a year to date or all activity. We keep track of SCT, DET, the cost table, and it gets extremely large. So you have to be very cognizant of what time frame you're running, and some of these can run fairly long. And then I typically am requested by the auditors to do the detail. You can do it summary, but that's not very descriptive. So you do a detail, then you can change that to detail. I don't even know why they give you blank fields, but you can if you want to. I've never done that. Next, then it processes, and then it outputs to a .prn file in your QAD home directory. And again, just beware of the file name. The file name can only be 8 digits, so you got to be kind of creative as to how you keep track of this. Then what I do is I copy from the QAD home directory onto either my hard drive or a network drive, and that outputs this document here. And this document is difficult to read. Auditors hate it. It's not very conducive to good analysis. So what the auditors have always asked us to do is to put it into a spreadsheet. You know, auditors like rows and columns. So you can take that .prn file and you can parse it into Excel. If anybody's done any parsing, especially of a document like this, Excel is not real good at that. So you can use a lot of different tools. We've used Monarch in the past, where you create a template for Monarch, and then Monarch will output that to an Excel spreadsheet. That's somewhat complicated, and you need to understand Monarch and its tools. Or you can actually go and do the detail output to 32 Printer, which is a tool that 32Soft offers. And this is real handy because Jacob and Christian have a little drop down here that sends to the Excel, and you can select Audit Trails, and voila, automatically into Excel. So it's very handy. So today we've kind of looked at some internal requirements. We've talked about configured screens, templates, standard users fields, required default tab order that you can set, adding fields and frames. Then we've looked at audit trails, setting up audit trails. I gave you some documents you could read for that, and then selecting tables and fields to report on, and then outputting from that 3612.2 into Excel for the pleasure of the audit teams. So that brings us to question and answers. I will give it back to Denise, and we can cover any questions that might be.
At the beginning, Don mentioned last month's webinar, and I had mentioned how we will send everybody a link to today's replay, but I just wanted to clarify that all of our webinars are available to everyone always, and the top navigation on our website, upper right, you'll see webinars, and that will get you there. You can also search the website if you're looking for something in particular. And if you can't find something you're looking for, give us a call. But I just wanted to clarify that all of our past webinars are always available. Also, real quick here, Don just mentioned 32 Printer. So real quickly, the 32 Printer is an output solution with some really cool features right out of the box with no programming. So I just wanted to give you a couple of the top features of the solution. It converts QAD reports to spreadsheets with one click. That's pretty awesome. And it can convert any text report. It doesn't even have to be QAD. And you can also create those invoices, orders, schedules, etc., right from QAD. There's more information on our website, or certainly give us a call if you're looking for a specific or detail or additional details. So now, as Don said, right,
just a quick, that 32 printer has saved my back end several times in terms of what the SOX auditors, Price Waterhouse, etc. want. So great tool.
Yeah, you had said that, and that's why I threw in those couple of things for the quick visual. So thanks, Don. I appreciate that. So again, if you haven't entered your questions down in the box where the arrow is pointing, go ahead and pop some in, and I'm going to switch gears and see if we do have any questions to start. Move along real quick. We have some upcoming webinars. We have how to automate QAD data uploads coming up next month, followed by customer schedules in October. I know Don had mentioned both of these. Registration is open for both. Links are available at the bottom of all of our communications and, of course, on our website as well. We also have, Don, I think, mentioned the Midwest User Group coming up next month, and in October, the West Coast User Group in Santa Barbara. So, as Don said, if you are going to be in attendance, please be sure to stop by. You will really, really make Don's day if you do. And so finally, what you don't see backstage is what really controls the show, and why internal controls are so essential. So as Alex said, from Don, the rest of the team, and me, thanks very much for your time today, everybody. And certainly we hope to see you again next month. Keep cool and have a great day.